Thank you. A lot of what I have to say follows on nicely from Nahed's talk and touches on some of the details, the important details that she pointed out. I want to do two things. They're kind of mixed up a little bit. I won't separate them out, but one of the things I want to do is not only to address the topic, which is the case for Palestine, but to ask the question, why do we need to address the case for Palestine? Why do we still have to make that case? That's a very important question in my view, and of course the related question is how we need to do that. Now, the reason for addressing that question is because it depends very much on the audience. This audience, as most of the audiences I have a great privilege of addressing, tend to be the converted. We're on the same side. I think that's a very serious problem, and there's a very important issue of how to speak and how to reach people who don't share our view generally. I'm frankly rather hoping that there are people, and I invited a few, who may not be the natural audience for a talk like this. So I think we who are supporters of Palestine need to think about how to reach out. So I have quite a few things to say about that. One of the ways in which that question arises, I've experienced personally, because I have quite a lot of arguments, as you might imagine, with those that are still willing to talk to me about it. Diminishing, especially in the Jewish community. But I value those occasions when I can, because I regard that as extremely important, and I think it is important for us and for Palestinians, because I think the Jewish community is crucial, needless to say. Let me illustrate the problem in a couple of ways. And if you share my view, you'll find this analogy plausible, but of course if I'm talking to somebody who is, let's say, very pro-Israel, Zionist, most of the Jewish community, they won't accept this, but my point can be illustrated in the following way. To take another controversy, or a couple that are publicly still debated, for example, global warming and the whole problem of climate change. In my view, and I think it's the widely held consensus, there is no room for debate. The facts are not controversial, and we're in deep trouble. But of course, as you'd be aware, there's a very intense public debate, but that's because it's political and it's ideological and their interests at stake. As far as the scientific questions are concerned, in my view, there's nothing to argue about. I use that as an analogy here, and I'll give you another example. In America, and here to some extent, the debate about biblical creationism and whether, Darwin in evolution is the correct theory, it's not open to serious intellectual dispute. On the other hand, it is debated intensely in the US and elsewhere. Now, as I say, if you're not a partisan of our views on Palestine, you won't find this plausible, but my problem is that I think, and I'm going to try to show by adding to some of the things that Nahed said, that in fact there is no room for dispute about the basic facts regarding Palestine, the historical facts and the facts on the ground, as they say today, and that leads to certain pretty clear moral and political conclusions that we ought to draw about how to proceed and what's right in international law and so on. So that's why I think it's important to talking about Palestine. So what I want to do is to actually turn to my slides, and I've got inevitably too many slides, so forgive me, I'm going to skip through. They're mainly to prompt me to talk about some of the issues, both historically and in the contemporary scene. And I'll do that, and again, I'm often thinking this is more use for an audience that doesn't already know. I keep hoping to address an audience like that, but maybe it's also of some use to you as well. So let me run through my slides, and again, I'll skip through them a bit quickly because I want to make the point that I've been making by illustrating and adding to some of the things that Nahed said. See if I can work this remote thing. Now, one of the ways in which the dispute comes up, and I was going to mention a personal anecdote. The difficulty I found in debating with people comes up in one case with a very old friend of mine, a Jewish friend I grew up with. And he says something very insightful to me. We've argued for years, and I will send him, oh, it's disappeared. I'll send him a book to read, which I think is authoritative. Why isn't this working? I'll send him Norman Finkelstein or Noam Chomsky to read, and he'll say, but for every authoritative academic or expert that I give him to read, he can give me a long list of people like Alan Dershowitz who have the opposite view. Now, this is a very serious problem, because from a kind of a neutral point of view, it really isn't clear how you decide who to believe. You've got a scholar of Harvard, a professor, a distinguished lawyer and academic, and he's saying diametrically opposed things. And for those of us on the Palestinian side, and I take this quite seriously, I have to know how to answer a very articulate, very knowledgeable argument on the other side. We must do that. But for the poor mug, so to speak, who's watching us, even with the best will in the world, when I tell him that he's wrong and he has no idea what he's talking about, it's not persuasive. And that's a difficulty that I'm confronting, and I think we have to take seriously. I'll give you another example before I proceed too far, while I'm thinking of it. I have another friend I argue with. He's a relatively recent acquaintance. He's more sophisticated than my first friend. I'm not mentioning names. This guy happens to be a former diplomat. He worked in Canberra in some spook intelligence operation in Canberra. He's a very sophisticated, intelligent guy. And we sort of liked each other, and we started meeting for lunches to discuss our obvious differences. And we had several lunches, but at one point, the difficulty was very intense and difficult and severe. And I said to him to try to sum up why we're having trouble here. And I tried to sum it up in the following way. I said to him, his name was also Peter, I said, Peter, here's the problem. One of us is completely wrong about everything. Now, that's the difficulty in talking to somebody who's educated and doesn't think any of the facts that we think are correct. Now, I want to put that, as it were, down as a problem that we need to figure out how to deal with, or at least it's a problem we're confronted with. Let me run through some more of the slides which are going to be about the facts that I think are important. It's going the wrong way. Now, of course, the story that we've had, and those of you old enough to remember the movie, have, the Leon Uris story of, the founding of the State of Israel. Most people, not just the Jews, most people in the general public, the media certainly have roughly that version. And it's difficult to deal with that. The history has now, of course, been seriously challenged by people called the new historians like Ilan Pappé, that describes that 48 as the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, a very provocative way of describing it, and he details the story. I didn't know that story growing up, and most of us didn't. And it's a shock because it's so horrible. It's absolutely an awful, really quite shockingly terrible story of a systematic ethnic cleansing and atrocities with which the state of Israel was founded. Reasonably enough, ordinary people, and especially the Jews, find it very hard to believe. And that's a serious issue we've got to deal with. And I'm talking about people with decent, good people of goodwill. They're not all ratbags. There are enough of them, but they're not all ratbags. Now, there's a lot to say. Here's some of the authorities that I cite when I'm talking to various audiences. And Nahed mentioned one, which is Adallah. I had the privilege of going to visit Adallah in Haifa, and they tell you all the legal discriminations about against Palestinians within what's called Israel proper, so to speak. But there are others. Al-Haq is in Ramallah. I visited there too. The wonderful director, Jabari, Shawan Jabari. He was here. So ICAD is the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. There's a whole range, the Breaking the Silence. There's a lot of evidence and information available if someone wants to follow it. One particular important organisation is DCI, Defence of Children International. I'll mention it now in case I forget. They've documented the terrible crimes against children. They're arrested, they're harassed, they're shot dead. Since the year 2000, something like 2,000 children have been shot dead. These are children who throw stones. It's horrible. I had an argument with one Jewish fellow I met a while ago. He has his son in the IDF and refused to believe that. We went through an interesting exchange, and finally, when I sent him the details, he was shocked that he saw that it's not controversial. They don't know. In fact, one of the other groups, Breaking the Silence, the Israeli group, we met one of their leaders when we were traveling there in Hebron, and he said, which is very important to understand, he said, and he's showing us Hebron, which I've got some slides on, he said, look, his mother in Tel Aviv has no idea what he's been doing or what this idea for doing in Hebron. This is very important for us to understand, that the ignorance among the Israelis and the Jews and the general public, and there's OCHA and B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, a bunch of these. There's other sources. I won't go through it all. Now, here's a slide. It happens to come up now, so I mention it. One of the things I want to take a bit seriously, but it's a kind of a joke, it's a parody, is a website that says, shit Zionists say. Now, it's a sort of a joke, but serious activists are on there making fun of the things which Zionists and others, of course, say. And I'm going to go through some of those because they're extremely interesting to try to show how we need to address what people think, and I'll come back to that. Including, for example, one professor in some respectable journal who says there's no occupation. I mean, it's hard to imagine that someone could actually say that, but, well, go figure. Now, part of the problem, I won't give you my full-blown lecture on Chomsky and the manufacture of consent and how not just the ordinary person, but educated people, sophisticated people are the problem. They're the most deluded, the most subject to delusions, illusions. That's a whole long lecture, but I won't talk about it. The alternative picture is presented in all sorts of sources. One very important one is the recent book by Rashid Khalidi, a professor at my former university, Columbia. The title speaks for itself. America, for example, who was running the negotiations, were not honest brokers, they were brokers of deceit. That's again very difficult to talk to people about. For example, just currently, you heard our Prime Minister, Turnbull, repeat the mantra, which both parties actually repeat. The problem is to get back to the negotiating table and restart the peace process. The peace process has been what has deprived the Palestinians of everything since Oslo, since 1993. I'll show you the maps if you haven't seen them. And it was a fraud, and it was, in fact, people like Edward Said and others left the Palestinian relationship with the PLO because he had an article the day after Oslo. It was called The Day After, the morning after. That betrayed the Palestinians and gave away anything. This is very hard to talk about. I have the privilege of going to Canberra, talking to the apologists occasionally, and they keep saying, let's just get back to the negotiating table. That's not the answer. By the way, while I'm thinking of it, I just posted on Facebook a wonderful response to this by Izzat Abdul Hadi, who's the ambassador for the Palestinian embassy here. He gave a wonderful interview, and he made the point rightly. The negotiations have been a fraud. They've deprived everything, and especially under the control of the Americans who are not honest brokers. He said the point is simply to obey international law in the occupation. There's no need. What have the Palestinians got to negotiate after all? Indeed. What have they got to give? They're under occupation, and so this is part of the issue. Let me run through this. Edward Said wrote a book years ago called Covering Islam, and he made a very important point about the problem, which is particularly acute for the Palestinians. The image we have of Palestinians especially, but all Arabs, is this one, the cartoon, and we don't usually see these ones. I love that picture, and it just, I like it because it tells you when you travel in Palestine, you meet Palestinians, they're not the monsters that are suicide bombers and murderers that most people think. And I had, again, the privilege of traveling in Palestine, meeting Palestinians in the West Bank, and I loved it because all my Jewish friends asked, were you safe? Well, yeah, he's one of the guys we met. Now, the idea that there's no occupation. I took these photos in Bil Ain, where there's every Friday a demonstration, and peaceful protesters with placards yelling slogans, they get shot dead, tear gassed, and I took that shot with the soldiers. They're miles from Israel. I mean, they're miles from the wall, and they just come and shoot peaceful protesters. Let me say something that occurs to me about this. One of the difficulties with the current conversation that's in the media is one state, two state. What did Trump say? And he's kind of let the cat out of the bag that maybe the two-state solution is not available. Nobody's talking about what's actually going on. It's not just a territorial problem about who's got what. I'm going to try to show you. It's the fact that people are being shot dead. There are 40 or 50,000 houses that have been demolished since 1967. Not for punitive reasons, but for arbitrary applications of the military laws to basically continue to ethnically cleanse the people in the West Bank. What's going on in the West Bank on the ground is not just a matter of where you're drawing lines and the boundary stands. It's the serious harassment, the brutality of the occupation. This is just on the entrance, inside the entrance to the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, inside the old quarter, the Palestinian area. What no occupation, you can hardly avoid seeing it. This is a guy walking out from that gate. I took these pictures, and they're harassed by these goons with dogs. And they just stopped and searched at the gate there. This is in Hebron. They stopped walking around in Hebron. That's a whole long story. I can't tell you the details of Hebron, but I'm trying to give you some picture, or an audience some picture who doesn't already know how appalling it is. That's East Jerusalem. I didn't take that particular picture. These are pictures from online. About what's going on, and that poor woman was shot dead in Hebron near the Ibrahimi Mosque, unarmed woman. This is a picture of the rally that followed the shooting dead of that poor Palestinian who was already on the ground, injured, and happened to be captured on on film by one of the Palestinians living in the city. I think it was Hebron, I think. And the rally in support of the soldier who's just been sentenced to 18 months. If you throw stones, you get sentenced. The Palestinians get sentenced for I don't know how many years, 10 years in jail. And this murderer was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 18 months or something. And the crowds rallied, yelling slogans, including in Hebrew, Ma'avet la'Aravim, which means kill the Arabs, and as opposed to kill them all. There's a degree of racist, genocidal racism in Israel that's beyond belief. And the public don't see this clearly. Let me go on. This is some of the checkpoints, the crowding at checkpoints in Hebron, the wall. This is in Bethlehem. That's Jeff Halper showing us the way in which the wall goes. Let me mention this because Nahed talked about Jerusalem and the awful legal and other administrative arrangements they suffer. The other appalling feature of the conversations about this is one of the representatives, one of our government ministers, said, look, the settlements are not the problem. They keep saying this. They're not the problem. They only take 3%. This is the most utter bullshit. I don't know how they get away with it. The wall takes, that dark area shows the wall. The wall takes on its own just 10%. So, I mean, if you drew a line or you drew a piece of string around the actual houses, it might be 3%. But so the wall is on its own about 9.5%. And I'll show you some of the other stuff. In the end, the Jordan Valley area, C, is 60%. I mean, you know, there's hardly anything left of Palestine. So let me quickly, how am I going for time, Stuart?
5-6 minutes.
I'll try and speed up. I'll rush through the history of it. This is, as it happens, the 100th year of the Balfour Declaration, very significant. You've got to stop and ask yourself, the Jews think this is great because they got back their homeland. You should have heard bloody Netanyahu talking about this. What the hell was the British Foreign Secretary giving away Palestine to the European Jews? What was going on? I'm left speechless. You know, how is this accepted as somehow an appropriate thing to have done by the British? Well, that's the imperial way of carving up the world. But, you know, it's not surprising the Palestinians were unhappy about this. They're blamed for not accepting the partition, which came much later, but as if that was some sort of failing on the part of them. Well, okay, this is the summary. The case for Palestine, this has been on bus stops and everywhere. It's very, very useful. And if you don't know the story, well, you know, the white bits were the bits that the Jews owned. They owned about 5%. They were only about 3% of the population early on, and by the time of 47, they ended up to be about 30%. The UN partition was the second picture, which, why did they even imagine this was going to work? I mean, so they gave the Jews the white bits, and then, of course, in 1967, in 1948, when the war broke out, they expanded further, and the Palestinians ended up with 22% of what was their historic Palestine. And of course now, that's what's left, the little bits and pieces that are unconnected. That's the history of Palestine, that's the case for Palestine. Why would anybody be surprised that the Palestinians are upset about this? What's to negotiate? Okay, and by the way, I won't go through them all, but this just reminds me, one of the most remarkable and interesting things is how much more honest the early Zionists were, that now is coming out with Trump and Netanyahu now. I mean, the Likud Charter says, nobody mentions this, the Likud Charter says there will be no Palestine from the River Jordan to the sea. It's not surprising, Netanyahu, but there was all just kind of a mask that is now dropped. They never had any intention. If you go back to Ben-Gurion, even Herzl, I don't know if you can see the slide here, Ben-Gurion and Herzl, here's Herzl, the founder of Zionism. We must expropriate gently, and they must do it discreetly and circumspectly. And they had this intention from the beginning. It was explicit, and it's been explicit since. So there's no illusion. I've got facts and figures here again about the way in which it all happened. I'll just skip through it. One of the things I do want to show you, though, is this map from Walid Khalidi, from a book called All That Remains. That's Israel proper, so to speak. All of those black dots were villages that were obliterated from what is now Israel. Between 400 and 500 villages were obliterated. I went to one, it's a pile of rubble, Shafuria, something like that. Sufuria. Another one I went to, which was intact, was this one. I took that picture, Lifter, just outside. It's a beautiful village, what they look like. There's nobody there. For one reason or another, didn't destroy it. Let me speed up. I've got other things that I want to say. The refugees, this was in Beirut, they're living in misery and unable to go back to Palestine. That's what that camp looks like. But I want to talk about a couple of things quickly in a couple of minutes, if I may, just rush through the slides. I wanted to show you, of course, what's going on in the West Bank. Mind you, this blue box, which Jews think is a charity to give money to the JNF, for years doesn't show a border. I mean, the Israelis simply have erased the difference. So when the complaint is that, you know, when there's a rally in the city, they chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and then they're criticised for wanting to destroy Israel. Well, I mean, you know, I'm just showing you that the Israelis have destroyed Palestine, apart from the brutality of the occupation. They're the ones that have made one state out of this. It's not exactly the Palestinians. And that's what the West Bank looks like. The dark brown areas are areas B and C, and they have a sort of municipal, local control over their lives, but the Israelis can come and go even in the areas that they have, Area A, under full Palestinian control. There are checkpoints and roads all over it. The children, let me keep going, because I want to mention Gaza. I've said a lot of this already, so these are the lovely pictures I like taking when we're travelling around. This is Nablus, which Nahed knows well. The soap, I brought back lots of soap, including, I didn't bring back Kanefi. Now, just in case you don't know what a settlement looks like, I took that picture from Bethlehem, looking across. I mean, on television now, fortunately, they're starting to show this. This used to be a hilltop, a forested hilltop. This is Palestinian land, and it's now this citadel, this huge. That's what has happened. East Jerusalem is being taken over. They're demolishing houses. There's Ariel Sharon House, which is just taken over, and poor old East Jerusalem is being now occupied increasingly. There's, I don't know how many, was it 200,000 Jews are just in East Jerusalem? Some huge number. Now, by the way, East Jerusalem, when you're talking about, somebody said, I think Netanyahu maybe, or somebody said, that, well, look, the settlements, or maybe Rubenstein from the Australian Ajax said, what's the complaint? They're just suburbs of Jerusalem, suburbs going all the way to Jericho, you know, basically cutting the West Bank in half. This is the kind of rubbish that you get out of the pro-Israel forces. This is what the settlements are looking like, and that line is the, oh, by the way, the white bit is what is Israel, and the rest of it is occupied Palestine. Let me keep going. I want to talk about Gaza before I, come on, why isn't this moving now? Oh, shit. What have I done? Is there something that I have to do to get the slides? Oh, bugger. Oh, there we go, thank you, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. House demolitions, I'll keep going. Water, they steal the water, that's Hebron, the Ibrahimi Mosque, where they're just marching there with their boots on. Shahada Street, which the Palestinians, the soldiers can run up and down the street, but the Palestinians are stuck behind a barrier there. Okay, that's Hebron. Hebron is the worst example. If you want to see the occupation in its horror, you go to Hebron. It's thousands of Palestinians are kept basically under curfew, more or less permanently. That's the markets in Hebron. I'll go to Gaza. This is the West Bank, South Hebron Hills. I won't talk about that. Let me talk quickly about Gaza. It's important to mention Gaza because we tend not to talk about that. It's been under a siege since 2007, under a blockade, which is brutal and it's becoming unlivable. The water is poisonous. These are pictures I took of the graffiti there. It's sort of like a third world country in Gaza. There's an area where inside the border, Stuart and I were there together, and there are farmers there that if they go to tend their tomatoes, they get shot. This is there's the tomato guy. That's Gaza City. That's the war. Now, I want to say something, I'll try and end on this. There's a few facts I want to give about the caste-led and the other wars. The main thing I want to talk about is the rockets. Netanyahu, every politician will say, of course, Israel has the right to defend itself against the rockets. Well, sort of it does. It wasn't defending itself. This graph was taken from the Israeli government's own website, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, which showed clearly, this is going back to the 2008-9 caste-led, but it was the same story, only a bit more complicated in 2014. In June of 2008, there was a peace agreement or a ceasefire negotiated with Hamas. Hamas honoured the ceasefire. Israel didn't. They had to lift the blockade and do a whole number of other things. And at one point Israel violated the ceasefire, and that period there where there was essentially, the few rockets were from fringe groups that Hamas can't necessarily control, but essentially they honoured the ceasefire. And when Israel violated the ceasefire on November the 4th, I think it was, in 2008, rockets started again. And then they used that as a pretext to bomb the shit out of Gaza. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures of that. There's the same story in 2014. Nobody knows this story because the media don't tell you. I didn't make it up. This is the Israeli government's own account. Now, they're the rockets, by the way. These homemade, whatever they do. And you ought to see the contrast. And that's the damage that a rocket does. This was published by one of the Jewish, the Zionist groups, showing the terrible damage. Well, they don't publish those pictures of what an Israeli rocket does. And this is what you may or may not have seen, but I don't think these pictures are shown. I've got a bunch of these. This is the devastation of... Now, this is what the Israelis have, and this is what the Palestinians are up against. They don't have an army. I mean, Naheed mentioned, they don't have forces. This is, by the way, the pictures that I show. I can't say I like to show them. I show them to indicate what Israel did to Gaza. These are residential suburbs. The idea of tunnels and rockets, whatever they may have done, doesn't warrant this atrocity, this war crime. Look at what Gaza looks like after the Israelis have responded to it. These are shocking pictures. I tweeted that one and I got thousands of responses to it. I said to people, imagine if this was Tel Aviv or Sydney. The world would stop it. I mean, this is beyond imagination. These are residential suburbs. So, and that's the kind of game that you can get, or we used to get for kids to play with. So I've spoken enough. Let me perhaps end by saying that we need to understand how to address people who don't know these facts. Many of you may be already sympathetic and know a lot of this stuff. I think it's fair to say that the public don't. And so we have to make the case for Palestine and not assume that it's available. Thank you very much.